Great. Welcome, everybody, to this session of the Russian Studies Seminar Series at UCL SSEES to discuss the hit book, The Compatriots, the brutal and chaotic history of Russia's exiles, émigrés, and agents abroad. Among many other things, this is a book about the enduring power of poison, but also, perhaps more importantly, about the enduring power of books in Russia. It gives me great pleasure, therefore, to introduce the two authors of this book, Irina Baragan and Andrei Soldatov. Irina and Andrei are leading investigative journalists from Russia who've already published two other books to great acclaim. Firstly, The Red Web, the struggle between Russia's digital dictators, and The New Nobility, the restoration of Russia's security state and the enduring legacy of the KGB, although I've listed them in reverse chronological order. All three books are published by Public Affairs. This afternoon, Irina and Andrei will talk about the book, The Compatriots, for around 25 minutes before we open up to Q&A. This session is scheduled to run until 5:15. So let me hand over now to Irina and Andrei. Thank you so much for joining us.
Ben, thank you very much, and thank you for having us. It's a great honor for us to talk today with such a great audience. First of all, some technical explanation of the title. In the vocabulary of Soviet propaganda, there were always two words describing Russians abroad: emigrant, and that was almost synonymous with enemy, defector, anti-Soviet element, or traitor. But people loyal to the Soviet authorities, in contrast, were always described using another word, compatriot. And now I give the floor to Irina.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Ben, for having us here. And as Ben said, we are Russian investigative journalists, and for more than 20 years, we've been focused on researching the ways in which the Kremlin controls the Russian people. We wrote two books, one on the Russian security services and another one about the Kremlin's wars on the internet. So it seems like the next natural step to look at another serious challenge to the Kremlin, the Russian outside Russia's border. But it also was a challenge to us too. No one from our families emigrated. The Russian diaspora is the third largest in the world, exceeded only by those from India and Mexico. China is fourth. That didn't start recently. Russians fled the country extensively for more than 100 years. The Tsar's crazy politics toward Jews, the revolution and civil war, the World War II, and anti-Semitism in Soviet Union forced millions to emigrate. In the 1990s, the time we remember very well, the emigration was in the spotlight of the society because the borders got opened and people began moving in both directions. Most of them came out of the country, but some of the emigrants went back to Russia to capture the new economic opportunities. As it turned out, the 1990s was the only decade in Russia's history when the country did not have political immigrants. When Putin came to power 20 years ago, he immediately reintroduced political immigration. Already in 2000, he was the first group of his political opponents to leave the country. Simultaneously, the Kremlin came to see Russian immigrants as a tool for promoting its influence abroad. The Kremlin created a concept of Ruski Mir, or Russian world, the worldwide community of Russian-speaking people whose identity is firmly connected to Russia's history, culture, and language. It is a community whose members are, by definition, closely tied to Russia. As a result, two things emerged over the last 20 years. First, Putin has been pushing his political opponents out of the country, sometimes literally putting them on the plane to take them out of Russia. That happened with Mikhail Khodorkovsky in 2013. And this August, Alexei Navalny, unconscious, was put on the plane to Germany after he had been poisoned in Russia. And it is very unclear whether he would be led back to Russia. Today there was news that the authorities now accused him of calling for a revolution, apparently to keep him out of the country. The second thing is, once out of Russia, in the West, the exiles present a challenge to the Kremlin, and the Kremlin takes this challenge very seriously, using all means possible to deal with them, including intimidation, spying, and even poisoning. In our book, we tell a story of Vladimir Karamurza, a Russian opposition politician who these days lives in Washington, D.C. Karamurza was poisoned twice when he visited Moscow. We spent 20 years writing about the Russian secret services, but we mostly focused on the domestic agency, the FSB. For this book, we researched the Russian intelligence agency, the SVR. It always enjoys a better reputation among journalists than the FSB. We discovered that this reputation was actually the result of a very successful disinformation operation, and we described it in the book. In reality, Putin's spies are very much like the Soviet KGB of the 1980s, and you know that the KGB was a direct descendant of Stalin's secret services. Stalin's obsession with political emigration and exiles was a defining element for his intelligence. When Stalin expelled his biggest political rival, a famous revolutionary Leon Trotsky, he still tasked his agent abroad to trace Trotsky and kill him. Stalin's obsession with Trotsky and his supporters was so great that he insisted to fight them even after Trotsky's assassination in August 1940 in Mexico. For instance, in January 1941, the Moscow Center sent a secret cable to the chief of its intelligence station in New York, urging him to intensify the struggle against Trotskyites. The World War II already started. France was invaded, and it was just 5 months before the Germans attacked the Soviet Union. As we described in the book, this experience defined message of Soviet spies even after Stalin's death and made a big, lasting impact on the modern Russian intelligence.
As Irina said, Russian immigration is a very large topic, and our book focuses on one particular thing, the tricky relationship between the Kremlin and the Russians abroad. And we show in our book how surprisingly important was the role of Russian immigration in the recent Russian history, and it went way beyond spying. And as we are now in London, in a global financial capital, so let's talk about money. And I wanted to tell you a story. In June 1978, in California, a 32-year-old engineer, Stan Rifkin, saw his chance to make really big money. Stan Rifkin ran a small computer consulting firm, and his firm had been contracted to install a computer system for the Security Pacific Bank in Los Angeles. Soon he realized he learned enough about the bank's money transfer procedures. The bank used a daily code, just 4 digits that changed every morning, that the bank clerk wrote down by hand and kept on display in the wire room. It was a way to transfer money out of the bank, but Rifkin wasn't a fool. He also knew he would need to come with a way to pick up the money after the transfer without being caught. Rifkin contacted a lawyer, a friend of his, and asked for advice on a sensitive issue. He said he was working for a large corporation now, and his boss needed to find an untraceable commodity he could use in his dealings with another corporation. Diamonds was the answer. The lawyer put him in touch with a well-respected diamond broker in Los Angeles. After 4 months of discussions, the two decided they found a way to purchase 10 million worth of diamonds. Now it was time for Rifkin to act. On Wednesday, October 25, the same year, Rifkin walked into the Security Pacific Bank building in downtown Los Angeles. Rifkin took the elevator, descended to the underground level, and went straight to the wire room. It was almost 5 p.m., a time when the wire room employees were already relaxed. The code was there in plain view. Rifkin wrote it down and walked out to the street to a payphone booth. From there, Rifkin phoned the wire room and said he was Mike Hansen from the International Department of Security Pacific, and he wanted to make a transfer. He said $10,200,000 exactly to the Irving Trust Company in New York for credit of the Voskhod Handelsbank of Zurich, Switzerland. He wanted 10 million for himself and 200,000 he had promised the broker. A young woman on the other end of the phone asked for the code. 4789, he said. And that was it. The woman thanked him and hung up. The next day, Rifkin flew to Geneva, and once there, he found an office of Rus Almaz. And Rus Almaz was a relatively new Soviet company based in Geneva, an exporter of Soviet diamonds. Rifkin wired money from Security Pacific and Los Angeles via the Irving Trust in New York to the Voskhod Bank in Zurich, where it was deposited in the Rus Almaz account, and the money duly arrived. Rifkin got his diamonds, a sparkling 8,600 carats. He successfully brought his stones to the States, and there he made his first mistake. Rifkin hastened to the lawyer in Los Angeles and showed him out of the blue his diamonds before the lawyer signed an attorney-client agreement. And the lawyer, of course, at once reported him to the FBI. Rifkin's haste made it into the Guinness Book of World Records under the category of biggest computer fraud, because the transfer of more than $10 million from a telephone booth on the street was very impressive. But very few people paid attention to the rest of the scheme. And in fact, the ease with which an American from Los Angeles could fly to Switzerland and pick up a suitcase full of Soviet diamonds right in the middle of the Cold War was perhaps even more remarkable. The explanation is that Rifkin made good use of the scheme developed by Soviet banks to bypass the American financial control. The Voskhod Bank in Zurich, where Rifkin sent his money to, was not a Swiss bank, though it was based in Zurich. It was part of a large network of Soviet banks abroad, Sovzagranbanki, and Voskhod means sunrise in Russian. This network extended from London to Singapore to Tehran to Paris to Zurich. Some of these banks were launched back in the 1920s, right after the revolution. Others, like Voskhod, started up in the 60s. And their mission was to help the Soviet Union buy, sell, and borrow in hard Western currency. But starting in the 60s, the Kremlin had another requirement for the banks: to operate in a way that was untraceable by the United States. This new requirement was prompted by one 1959 lawsuit. A Russian émigré in the United States sued the Soviet Union in a New York court. She was a holder of several obligations to two English corporations with pre-war concessions in the Soviet Union. And she accused Moscow of failing to make payments. She also brought a suit against Chase Manhattan Bank for transferring money from the accounts of Soviet banks. That so scared Soviet bankers in Moscow, they actually envisaged that all their accounts could be blocked in the West, that they moved their accounts in dollars to Soviet banks abroad, in Paris and London. And after that, the new objective for these banks was to make Soviet dollar transactions completely impenetrable for the US government. But even in this collection of banks, Voskhod in Zurich was very special. The Soviet government tasked the bank with one very sensitive mission: to sell Soviet gold. It worked like this. Soviet gold was transported to Zurich by Aeroflot passenger aircraft, 5 to 7 tons of gold per flight. Ingots of 12.5 kilograms were distributed evenly under the passenger seats because the gold was heavy and the aircraft had to be carefully balanced. The Voskhod Bank also helped sell diamonds, cooperating with Rus Almaz. The Soviet government also put Voskhod in charge of working with American banks. There was no Soviet bank abroad in the West and in the United States. And one of them was the Irving Trust. Remember, that was the bank Rivkin transferred his money via from Los Angeles to Zurich. Rivkin didn't develop that scheme, as he honestly told us now. It was developed by the Soviets. And the beauty of that scheme was that even after Rivkin's arrest, the Los Angeles bank's money was still in Moscow. And a Soviet magazine gleefully remarked back then, the ending of this story is awesome. There are no victims in it. The Swiss company made an excellent deal. But as we know, it was not the Swiss company, but Soviet. Thus, the Soviet Union devised a very smart scheme how to make very sensitive transactions in dollars untraceable by the United States. They, by the way, even gave this currency a new name, Eurodollars, because it to make it and to keep it out of reach of the Americans. And this scheme was also used to sell gold and diamonds. And all of that because one Russian émigré in the late 50s brought a silly lawsuit against the Soviet Union. Was it the end of the story? Of course not. The guy who was the head of Rosalmas in Geneva, by the way, his name is Malinin, enjoyed a long and successful career in the Soviet Union and in Russia. In the 2000s, he became head of Brillante Alrosa, the cutting and polishing division of now the world's largest diamond mining company, Alrosa. Remember the bank Irving Trust, the American bank used by Rivkin. In the 1990s, this bank was acquired by the Bank of New York. The bank by then had a very talented team working in the Soviet Union, headed by a recent Russian émigré, another Russian émigré. And very soon, Bony, Bank of New York, became the main clearinghouse in Russia, and it was a sign of pride for the Russian bankers to have an account with Bony back then. And in the late 1990s, Bony became the focus of the first major money laundering scandal between the US and Russia. By that time, Putin was the president, and the investigation in Russia quietly died. But what about Soviet banks abroad? Well, most of them survived the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the scheme is still alive and well, as we could detect from what is going with them now. Voskhod Bank in Zurich was acquired by Gazprom Bank and almost immediately put under US sanctions and it was put in the so-called sectoral sanctions list because of Russia's war in Ukraine. The former Soviet bank abroad here in London, it's called Mosnarbank or Moscow People's Bank, is also operational. Last year, it was also put under American sanctions, but not because of Ukraine, but because of its dealings with the Maduro regime in Venezuela. The bank apparently was involved in money laundering because it helped Venezuela to launch the country's first cryptocurrency, Petro. The schemes probably were developed during the Cold War, but it does mean they became outdated or obsolete because we have more and more Western sanctions coming against the Kremlin regime. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Irina and Andrei, for that fascinating combination of a general overview of what the book does, but also that brilliant story, as you say, tailored to the fact that London is one of the financial capitals of the world, at least for the moment. So to the audience, if you'd like to ask a question, you can do that in two ways. You can either ask it by typing in the chat function in Zoom, and you can see I've already used the chat function to include a URL to the book. For those of you who haven't bought it, I highly recommend that you do, either through the publisher, although Irina and Andrei have told me that I can also recommend you buy it through Amazon as well, or your local independent bookshop, which we should be supporting right now. So you can type your question into the chat function in Zoom, or if you raise your hand, I will try and keep a tally of the order in which people raise their hands, and I'll call on you to unmute and to ask your question live, so to speak. So please do type in your questions or raise your hand, but I'm afraid I'm going to abuse my position as chair to ask the first question, and I hope the audience don't mind. I'll promise to be quick. And I want to say, Irina, you mentioned this emerging story about Navalny, this suggestion that maybe he called for the violent overthrow of the constitutional order in Russia in the 27th of April transmission of Echo Moskvy. And certainly that was the reporting this morning. It turns out that the investigative committee has come out and denied that reporting subsequently, but it still raises an interesting question of the tools that the Kremlin might use to discourage Navalny from coming back to the country. And it made me immediately think of the very final paragraph of your book. And if you'll let me, I'll read it out. It's quite short. That it is now possible for the regime's opponents to return to Russia, and very difficult, if not impossible, to keep them out, may eventually remove another stigma and end another time-honored tradition. And this, one hopes, could put the country on a path toward normalcy. I thought it was a wonderfully optimistic note on which to end the book. So my question is, to what extent does this suggestion of the case regarding Navalny push back against your optimistic ending for this book?
It's very difficult to say now for sure, but it seems that the Kremlin are so frightened of Navalny, they're so scared of his popularity and of his actions that they're ready to do anything to stop him, prevent him from getting back to the country. So my guess, and also we discussed this many times with Andrei and with many of my Russian colleagues and Russian lawyers, and they all think now that we don't know which form the Kremlin can use to prevent him from entering into the country, because it's unlawful. There is no way legally to prevent Navalny from coming back to Russia. But we think that they try to do everything not to allow him to get to Russia and to get back to Russia. And it reminds us, because I think that the Kremlin is having a deal with dissidents and with their political opponents. The Kremlin is getting closer to the Soviet practice. And back then, there was very usual to deprive a dissident from Soviet citizenship and expel him or her from the country. So we think that they could try something like this, but it's very difficult to say how they can do this, but because there is no law about
right
this right now. Maybe they try to adopt some new law. It is very likely, because you know to adopt a new law in Russia now takes like a couple of weeks. So we don't know now.
But we stay largely optimistic because, well, maybe because of the subject of our previous book, the Red Web, which was all about the internet. The borders might be, well, they remain porous. Maybe not for Navalny. Maybe for him it would be some special thing. But it's still open for many of his supporters, and of course, it's open for the internet, and his message would still be completely accessible for people living in Russia, which is the way and the thing for many Russian journalists who now live abroad. And look, right now the most popular Russian independent media is based abroad and is the most popular independent media in Russia, Medusa. So it gives us some hope that thanks to technologies and thanks to the thing that people actually move in all these directions constantly. Well, not now, of course, COVID changed this, at least now. But I think you cannot get back to the 70s just like that. It's absolutely impossible. Back then, it was absolutely different.
Thank you both for that. So let me read out the first question from the chat from Stephen. And Stephen says, Irina mentioned that Putin has returned the idea of exiling people abroad, for example, Khodorkovsky. Might he also stop free travel for Russians, as was the case in Soviet times? And given that the vast majority of Russians still don't travel, would many people accept it? I realize your response to my first question touched on it a bit, but I suppose more directly asked the question, how likely is it that, that Putin will stop international travel?
Oh, it's, I don't know, constant fear of Muscovites. And, you don't know, few people from Russia can travel abroad, not because of Putin, but because of COVID restrictions. And it's really put people into constant fear. Muscovites are angry that they can't travel, but in Russia, it's overall not more than 10 or 15% of people who can travel abroad. But 15%, it's also a huge percentage in terms of because they are active people, they're involved in political activity, they have money, they're good educated. So 15%, it's okay. But we don't know whether Putin prohibit Russians from traveling abroad or not, and when it comes.
I don't believe. I think it's. I don't think it's a great idea for him right now, because it's much smarter to let people out of the country, because in this case you have a choice. As Khodorkovsky told us for this book, that look, if you have this option either to fight this desperate fights in your country or just leave the country, and well, you might lose some social status, but at least you would be safe. And well, for lots of people, it's a good choice, and they just leave the country. And on the way, many of them forget about any political activity, and we don't see huge Russian political emigre organizations right now. They are relatively small and insignificant, which means that in reality, the threat posed by the emigrant community is not really big. But the problem is that, as Irina said in her presentation, the Kremlin is a bit paranoid about the threat posed by emigres. And you can trace this back to the days of the Russian Revolution. Lots of people we spoke to, especially in the secret services, they really believe that the Russian Revolution of 1917 was made by a bunch of emigre revolutionaries brought by the German general staff to Russia, and they actually ruined this mighty Russian empire. And this school of thought believes that if given a chance, another group of emigres who might look very insignificant, if given a chance, they can get back to Russia and destroy another mighty Russian empire. So the problem is that we are dealing not only with reality, but also with perceptions of people who are entrenched in a very Soviet experience of Russian intelligence.
Yeah. Logically, to ban people traveling abroad can create and definitely create more pressure for the Kremlin, because people will be, rich people and wealthy people will be angry, they will be outrageous, and they can do something politically. But having a deal with idea of traveling, an idea of immigrants, and having a deal with political opponents, Kremlin are not very rational. It always goes crazy. So let's see.
Or say, to put it more, I don't know, they just, it goes emotional.
Emotional.
Thanks both.
Emotional.
I'm going to go now slightly out of the order in which the questions have been written into the chat, just seeing the ones that might be related to what we're currently talking about. Ed asks, would it be in the interests of the West to allow visa-free travel for Russian citizens below the age of, let's say, 25? Hopefully the Kremlin would respond tit for tat. What do you think about that?
Well, actually, right now we see some, I would say that actually it's going better, surprisingly better. With and it's easier now to get Russian visa than say just a year ago. Right now, the new Russian Prime Minister Mishustin, he introduced a new thing. Now you can get a so-called electronic visa, and you can apply online. You can get this visa. You don't need for that to go to the embassy, as far as I get it. And if your intention is to travel only for 14 days, so actually it looks like some people, especially some officials who are in charge of economic bloc, they're quite desperate to ease these requirements and to encourage people to travel to Russia. And of course, we understand that it should be only that these things work only in two directions. So let's see.
Thanks for that. Okay, the next question, it probably makes sense to ask another question from Stephen. Andrei, are you confident that the internet can be kept open, or could Russia seriously restrict access to the World Wide Web? Andrei and Irina, of course.
We think that actually it would be absolutely impossible to cut off Russia from the internet completely. And yes, we have we have a lot of repressive legislation, and the Russian internet has been censored since 2012. And right now we have this new legislation, something about national sovereignty. And it was reported in many media that the idea is to have this option to cut off the internet completely. But actually, it's not about that. What the Kremlin understood is that the most dangerous content is generated not out of Russia, but within Russian borders. We are talking about people like Navalny, we are talking about lots of anti-corruption videos, and this stuff, recordings of manifestations, protest rallies, all these things happening in Russia and recorded in Russia. And it's not like in the 70s when the Voices of America and Radio Free Europe were so important. Right now, the most interesting stuff is coming from Russia. So the idea of all this legislation is to have another option at hand. To have an option, if something going on in one particular region, for instance, some natural disaster like Chernobyl, or really big protests like in Khabarovsk, to have an option to cut off this particular region from the rest of the country, to prevent the protest spreading, and that this seems to be the main goal. So that's why I do not believe in borders, online borders. Also, we need to remember that Russian economy is hugely dependent on the internet. We have not only cryptocurrencies, but we have lots of things. Online banking is really big in Russia. You cannot just cut this like in the 70s. It's just impossible.
Thanks for that. Connor asks, Yuri Andropov is often accused of being the figure who accelerated the movement of commodities and capital out of the Soviet Union. Did he change the system of hidden banks that you discussed, or did he just continue the trend that began in the 1960s?
I would say he continued. It started, as I said, because of this lawsuit in New York, and it was the beginning of the 60s. So it started definitely not with Andropov, and he was not actually in charge of updating this system. So the bankers, especially the Gosbank, was in charge of this system. Of course, the KGB, they found a way how to use this system because, look, they needed to support a lot of guerrilla movements all over the world. And of course, they used this system to channel money. But remember that in the Soviet Union, the most sensitive things, like the secret funding of social democratic movements and communist parties in the world, was handled not by the KGB, but by Politburo, because it was such a sensitive thing that the Communist Party leadership wanted to keep it to themselves. They used the KGB, and they used these banks, but it was for them, for political people, to decide how to do that, not for people like Andropov. So when Andropov took over, like after Brezhnev died, the system was already ready and well operational.
Thank you for that. Now, a comment before a question from Mark Gagliotti. I'm now going to read out his comment first. On a very specific point, I was very happy. You're excellent, and that's in, I suppose, a version of putting it in bold, that your excellent book paid proper attention to Trillicer, a much neglected figure, in my opinion. Mark, of course, talking here. Less nerdishly, how do you see the difference between the way the Kremlin could mobilize the compatriots, in your usage of the term, in the past, when they had both nationalism and ideology to draw on, and now when really they only have nationalism?
Well, you know that we tried to do a kind of field study in the United States, because look, the 2016 Russian interference in the election should be supposedly the best case study for such a thing, for the compatriots networks in the United States, because all of these organizations were already in place before the elections, before 2016. And we describe in the book that actually many of these organizations were launched well back in the 2000s and early 2010s. So they were all there, and we expected, because we investigated the online element of his story before, we expected that the offline element, the compatriots organizations, would be used by the Kremlin as well. And to our big surprise, we found out that actually nobody tried to activate these networks in 2016 or 2015. And it came as a big surprise to us. And we have several theories why it happened. One of the theory goes that because the online element, the cyber operation, was exposed so early, already in June, by the way, as it happens, another Russian émigré, Dmitry Alperovich, who was the founder of the company CrowdStrike, and they exposed Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear. And because this element was exposed so early, and it was such a big disaster, that probably some people in the Kremlin decided that, oh, look, it's better not to sacrifice in this mess what they cultivated for so many years. And so they decided against activating these networks. But it's just one theory. We do not have a clear answer. What we know is that actually these networks were never tried in a real political situation. So we have them. We have church organizations, we have compatriots organizations, we have cultural centers, we have all these manifestations like the Immortal Regiments, and of course all of them present such quite a, I would say, interesting picture. But actually the truth is they were never really used by the Kremlin to achieve a particular political goal.
Yeah, and to be, you know, that to be immigrant, it's not easy. Even when you, even for second generation of immigrants, even if you were, even if you grew up in the United States or here in the United Kingdom or was educated here, a lot of people, while researching the diaspora here in the United Kingdom and in the United States, we found out that a lot of people, even in second generation of emigration, they have a lot of sentimental feelings to Russia. And for me, it was very I was surprised that most of immigrants in the United States, especially those who lived in Brighton Beach Russian community in New York, they supported the annexation of Crimea. And it's like 90%, even second generation. So there are a lot of things that Putin's operative can use to attract immigrants, to promote the Kremlin's idea, to help the Kremlin to do anything abroad, and so on and so forth. It's I don't know, it's a good base. I mean, immigration, it's a vulnerable society, it's a vulnerable kind of community, and it is very fertilized ground for recruitment. It doesn't mean that all of immigrants are agent or possible agent or could be agent, maybe agent, but it's still, it's very good. they are can be attracted by different ideas of the Kremlin.
It's interesting. Thanks for that. On page 303, in case people have got their book next to them while we're having this discussion, you say when talking about compatriot organizations in the US, you refer to them as Putin's regiment. And you say that that regiment is still there and could be activated any time, which to me was interesting because you're leaving that hanging and you're suggesting that going forward, things could be very different. So let me ask a speculative question. Given that it's likely that Biden will be the next president of the United States, do you imagine that these networks, as you put it, Putin's regiment, compatriots in the US, will be activated?
Wow, it's a really good question. And I think to some extent they, of course, could be activated, especially if we are talking about recruitment for something not politically exposed, something like espionage, some very particular influence operations. That, of course, is entirely possible. The question of a bigger political involvement, something really big, I think it's. I don't think that it could happen right now. I think the problem is that what we need to understand that 2016 actually had a huge impact on the Russian, say, intelligence and security establishment. Many Russian intelligence agencies actually suffered a lot because of this scandal. The FSB, the Russian domestic agency, which is now has also a foreign intelligence branch, they lost a lot of facilities in the United States. Also, because of this cyber scandal, it's well, actually, we got some big scandal in Moscow, and the cyber branch of the FSB was purged, and the head of the branch was fired. His 2 deputies were arrested. Some people were sent to jail out of fear that they might actually leak some information to the Americans. And the very first time in the history, we got FSB officers on the wanted list of the FBI. It's big. When we got, later on, we got the Skripal's case. And after that, another agency came under big pressure, the Russian military intelligence. And we got thousands of agents and operatives exposed thanks to Bellingcat and some other entities and media. And of course, all of these scandals, they prompted these agencies to do some damage control. And I think that could last for at least for some years, because we need to rebuild their networks, we need to replace people, they need to rethink some ideas. And when we hear of some cyber operations, we just need to understand for the Kremlin, cyber operations are relatively low-cost operations. But offline operations, well, networks of agents in foreign countries, this is a completely different league. For that, you need more investment, more time, more people, more resources, and it's extremely expensive. And to replace these people or to do something about them, it cannot be done just in a click. It cannot be activated, reactivated every year. So I expect that right now, I do not expect some really big political operation starting. Well, at least I hope so.
Thanks for that. Going back to the media and I suppose the internet, this is a question from James. A bill was recently tabled in the State Duma to restrict access to social media platforms like YouTube and Twitter, which quote unquote censor Russian media like RT, Sputnik, etc. Who do you think might ultimately be behind this bill? How likely is it that the bill will be passed? And if it does get passed, would it be enforceable?
I think that it's very likely that it will be passed, and it will be, but it's unlikely that it will be implemented in reality, because in Russia we have so many restrictive laws on the internet that even now it's enough to it's enough law to block all international social media, because they already prohibited a lot of Russians law In terms of blocking, they don't block what the Kremlin want. In terms of transferring data of its users, they didn't do this in most cases if users are not criminals, and so far and so on. So, but Kremlin, so far, Kremlin didn't do this. It didn't block any big social media except LinkedIn. And LinkedIn, it's a very even LinkedIn, it's not a problem in Russia because you can have an access. You can get access easily using a VPN or even special extension in your browser. So that's not a problem. But so far, the Kremlin didn't do this. So I don't think it will. But it's another stick to show, in order to show international platforms that they are under control. They should be cautious having to deal with Kremlin. They should be cautious on their policy in Russia.
Yeah, it's a good negotiation strategy. You just give more and more threats, and then you start applying pressure on the platforms. And we've been doing this like for the last 7 years, not very successful actually.
Thanks both. Next, a question from Tony. What is the role played by Nichestra and Ruski Mir Foundation in engaging Russian diaspora communities and promoting Russian narratives abroad?
Well, it is quite, I would say, successful, because it's, and well, if you compare these efforts with what we had back in the Soviet days, now it's supported by the church. And in many cases, you have cooperation between Rossotrudiche and the church. For instance, in France, in Paris, now there is a huge cultural, spiritual center, and they have really remarkable events and exhibitions and almost everything. They have really great building, very impressive. So these kind of things are happening, and they're quite, I would say, they're quite impressive. And right now, Rossotrudiche just got a new chair, Evgeny Primakov, formerly known as Sandro. He's a former journalist with the experience in the Middle East. And after his granddad died, Evgeny Primakov Sr., so he decided to get his real name and became known as Evgeny Primakov Jr. And he's quite aggressive at his approach. He just decided to ban a dictant. I don't know how to say it. So it's actually based on the writings of a Russian writer, Gluchovsky, because Primakov decided that this author is not patriotic enough. And of course, these stories are also tied with some spy scandals. If you look at, as far as I remember, the last scandal we had with the Russian Cultural Center was in Washington, D.C. just 3 years ago. And the head of the Russian Cultural Center was exposed by FBI and investigated by the FBI because he tried to build a database of students, American students, who decided to go to Russia to study. And this guy, he tried to create a database of these people, their vulnerabilities, for a possible recruitment. So you see that some of the old traditions they've been developing like since the Soviet times are still very much alive, despite the new phase and the new wars they use and the new cooperation with the church.
I have to explain that Rossotrudichestvo is a huge organization, and the main idea of Rossotrudichestvo is this is a soft power, but this is cultural center, this is spreading propaganda, or maybe a good look at the Kremlin's activity in the West and on Russia, and so far and so on. But of course, we all know that Rossotrudichestvo is a good cover for security services activity, for security services operations, for intelligence operations, but that's not the main goal of this organization. At the same time, as a big cultural organization, having offices in literally in every country, maybe, I mean, literally in every country in the West. Россотрудничество has a lot of opportunity to unite immigrants and diaspora around its cultural centers and other organizations. And so it provides them with opportunity to have something like a databases on Russian immigrants who have a very favorable view of the Kremlin. So it's not simplistic. It's not very straightforward. It's quite complicated.
Thanks for that. The next question from Irina. Could you please say a few words about the techniques you use in your investigations?
Oh, a lot of.
Well,
as
we've been writing about secret services since 1999, I think, and we've been developing and cultivating sources inside. And it might sound a bit surprising, but actually there is a lot of people inside who are not extremely happy with their leadership. The difference is that in the West, if you have, say, whistleblowers, these people, they want to talk to the media because they are unhappy about something really big, like the constitution and the liberal values and freedoms. In Russia, it might be much more. It might be much more particular. Like, I know a lot of people in the FSB and SVR who are just unhappy with their salaries, or maybe they think they are treated unfairly by their superiors, or there's something going on with their apartments, and that prompts them to go to people like us. And because we've been doing these things for so many years, they sort of trust us. These days, I think the only way to do a really good job is to talk to people. You still need to tell your stories. And this book is based on dozens of interviews with lots of people. And in some cases, we needed to interview one guy, well, actually dozens of times, because you need to understand what makes these people tick. It's actually for us, what we wanted to do, we didn't want to write a database of Russian, say, activities abroad. We wanted to show something based on people. And actually, in the center of this book is a very human story of one particular family. And this family was started by two most successful Stalin spies. One of them, he actually organized the assassination of Trotsky. Another one, the second one, was the chief of a Russian spy station in New York during the war. And what we wanted to show that there is a continuity. And we traced this family right to the present day. And the portrait of the second guy is still on display in the offices of the present chief of the Russian SVR, Narishkin. So, and that for us is a sign, is a proof that actually we have this continuity between what started like in the 20s and what's going on today.
Today everybody is crazy about digital investigations, and we started because there are a lot of databases available, and we started investigating digitally 20 years ago, because in Russia, even maybe earlier than it happens here in the West, because in Russia, we have a lot of databases illegally leaked to the black market, and you could easily buy this. And when we were criminal reporters, we did this quite frequently. And it provided us with opportunity to investigate everything, everybody. You can find every person, real estate, cars, I don't know, way of living, everything. But the more years passed since then, the more I believe human sources. And human sources, in comparison with digital investigation, human sources are precious. We can't even estimate how useful they are. And when you have a lot of digital data, very often you can't understand what is the relationship between people, how they connected, who was first, who was second, who is the real beneficiaries of all this scheme, why this person worked for that person. And is the second reason why I love digital, why I love human sources, that it explains us psychology. It explains us why people are doing this and that, and it makes our investigations more human, and it makes our investigations interesting for people. So for me, it's always my main investigative techniques is so simple as usual was for any journalist in the world. It's to make person interested in your topic, to ask questions and to get answers, to get information, and then check this.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that. Let me ask, and I see that Elena has thanked you for your response, a really full response. I thought you were going to be more guarded and say, we're not telling you, but it's good. You are transparent and honest. Let me ask a question. It definitely, because I realize we're coming to the end of the event, and I know that some people will have to leave on the hour, but let me ask this question. It's clear from the book that you make one key point about the power of books published abroad and their reception in Russia. And that's something, you make that point explicitly 3 or 4 times, and it certainly comes across strongly. So I want to ask a question: how has the book been received in Russia? How has the Compatriots been received? I know that currently, is it being read out? Portions of it are being read out by an Echo Moscow journalist.
Yes.
So how has it been received in the country?
To be honest, the thing is that what probably we need to explain this to our audience, that because the situation we have in Russia, we adopted these tactics many years ago, actually more than 10 years ago, where we write our books first for our American publisher. So the books get published in the United States and the United Kingdom, and then usually a year later they get translated into Russian, which sounds really crazy. So you have Russian writers writing something in English just because we hope that one day it could be picked up by a Russian publisher and they would be brave enough to publish it in Russia. So the book actually in Russian came out this September, and initially we were very skeptical that people would be really interested in this topic, because usually people don't want to read something which makes them really uncomfortable. And in this book, there is a lot about poisonings and really tough stuff. For instance, we wanted to show that Russian foreign intelligence was not an intelligence organization they love to in the white gloves like we want to present themselves. It was a very bloody organization, always involved in suppressing dissent in Russia, no matter outside Russia or in the country. And so it's in a way it's a bit depressing. Not depressing, but it's troubling. But to our surprise, the book immediately became a bestseller in Russia. Mm-hmm. And Tatiana Felgengauer, a very good friend of ours from Echo Moscow, she came to us and offering a very interesting idea to read out aloud our book chapter by chapter on her YouTube channel, which is very popular. And every Sunday at 9 p.m. Moscow time, she actually sits with our book, reading 2 chapters, sometimes 3 chapters, and it's just amazing because people actually listen to that. For us, it was absolutely, unexpected.
Unexpected, and we're absolutely happy that book was so well received in Russia, because the Russian readers, for us, they are precious, and we love that they are so kind to.
Yes, to the book.
To get the book properly.
What about the reception from your sources within the FSB and the SVR? I imagine that's a particular community within the broader Russian community. So what's their response been like, insofar as you can generalize?
Yeah, of course. I had some conversations with foreign intelligence people, and because there is a chapter in the book which was very difficult for us because it's quite technical. It's a description of how the system worked back then, and who was in charge inside of foreign intelligence for, say, dealing with immigrants. And it was always tricky because it looks like every few years the KGB just created another department to deal with émigrés because we were so scared of them and paranoid about them. And I was a bit nervous that this part would be met with some criticism from these people, because I thought maybe I would make some mistakes. Fortunately, actually, we were told, no, it's fine. But it was quite interesting that they said everything is fine about the book until 70s and 80s. After that, it was pure democratic propaganda. And you immediately understand what does it mean, actually. So we are quite happy talking about the past. It might be a bit uneasy still for them, but we are sort of in private conversations, they accept that actually they have a very bloody past. But we're absolutely not ready to accept that something not completely rosy is going on right now.
Fascinating. Well, I think that brings us to the end of this event. Irina, Andrei, thank you so much for joining us. Again, for those of you who haven't bought the book, please do go out and buy it. It really is a brilliant, brilliant read. Thank you very much, audience members, for joining on this Zoom call. Thanks for posing so many great questions. Once more, Andrei, Irina, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us here. Bye.
And thank you for everybody who listened to us. Thank you.